It's really nice to be here and to thank the organisers, Adley in particular, for helping make it possible. And thanks to everyone for coming to listen and to talk and do so, specifically listen to me in English. Obviously, I'm very grateful for that. And I don't take it lightly that it's obviously not the first language of everyone here by any means. So what I'm going to do this evening is I'm going to talk about. So I've got my notes here. I'm going to talk about housing crisis. In a quite a general sense, actually. So I am going to talk about financialization and the role of financialization in housing crisis, but I'm going to try and zoom out a little bit and try and, I guess what you might say, is situate issues of finance and financialization within a bigger picture. And I think one of the reasons I want to do that is that so much of the debate and discussion around finance and financialization sort of abstracts from wider problems. And one of the things I'm going to try and argue when I talk about is that it's very, very important to think about housing crisis as a kind of overdetermined problem where there's all sorts of different factors that are and have been involved in creating the situation that we have today. And obviously we have that situation not just in Spain, but it feels like we have a housing crisis pretty much everywhere these days, pretty much anywhere I can think of. Certainly in Sweden, where I live, things are pretty bad there as well, and certainly in pretty much every English-speaking country I can think of. So that's what I'm going to try and do is situate issues of finance and financialization within a broader story. I guess the first thing to say is that what I'm going to talk about is very much not a Spanish story. So I am anything but a Spanish expert. So I'm going to be talking about housing crisis in a much more general sense, not necessarily a global sense, but I'm going to be talking about it as a general story. Spain will certainly crop up in some of the things I say, but the story I'm going to tell is a much more general one, of which some parts are obviously much more applicable in some countries than in others. And I'll try and point to some of those differences as I go through this. So Spain is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a much more general story. And I'm going to go through the talk in 4 parts. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is just kind of housing crisis generally, how we might understand housing crisis, in what sense housing is in crisis. That's the first thing I'm going to do. Second thing I'm going to do is run through some of what I think are the most significant factors behind contemporary housing crisis, some of the things that we can point to in more than one country and say, yeah, look, this has been a significant factor in creating conditions of housing crisis in a kind of a general sense in more than one country. The third thing I'm going to do is then focus specifically on finance and financialization. And just to be clear, at the beginning, when I use that term, which is a very sort of widely invoked but also much contested term, I have 2 particular things in mind when I use that term. So the first of those is what I would refer to as the growing involvement of what you might call financial actors, financial institutions, like private equity firms, the likes of Blackstone, who have obviously been much in the news over the past decade or so when it comes to housing, not least in Spain and Barcelona. So the growing involvement of financial institutions of various types in the ownership and operation of housing and housing portfolios. That's the first of them. And the second way in which I'm using it, which is very much linked to the first, is what some academics refer to as the growing treatment of housing as a kind of a financial asset. So, and to use kind of political economic terms, what people mean by that is that housing increasingly comes to be treated for what is referred to as exchange value, rather than for its use value. So the exchange value of the asset comes to be prioritized over its use value as a form of shelter. Now, of course, housing has always been both of those things. It's, one of the reasons I dislike so much of the literature on financialization is there's this kind of myth that we used to live in this kind of paradise where people only cared about the use value of housing, and then everyone became evil and started treating it as a financial asset, which of course is nonsense. It's always been both of those things. But I think the reality is that the balance between them has perceptibly shifted in recent decades. So it's not like we went from use value to exchange value, but we went from a situation where use value was more prioritized than it arguably is today, at least by certain types of owners and operators of housing. So that's the second argument. Of course, those two things are very, very closely linked right now. So I'm going to talk about financialization. And one of the things I'm going to suggest is that it's really important to understand financialization in context, by which I mean we can only really understand the financialization of housing by situating it in the context of those other factors that I will already have talked about as being important in germinating housing crisis. And so one of the things I want to suggest is that financialization is arguably as much a symptom as a cause. It's both of those things, and you'll see what I mean when I get to talk about it. And then the last thing I'll talk about, relatively briefly, is some of the implications of this, and particularly the implications in terms of kind of what now, and what might the right to housing as a concept actually mean in the specific housing crisis context in which we find ourselves today. Where do we go from here? How might a substantially improved situation potentially be brought about? So that's what I'm going to try and do. One other thing before I start, if I say something while I'm going through this, please don't hesitate to interrupt. If I say something and you're like, what the hell is he talking about? Just interrupt me. I don't mind being interrupted at all. Don't sit there going, what the heck is he talking about? Just say, what the heck are you talking about? Okay, so I'm going to start with, as I said, just by talking about crisis, and with the fact that housing crisis does feel to be more or less ubiquitous these days. Obviously including in Spain, but not only in Spain. And I suppose that, at least when I think about housing crisis, I think of it particularly in terms of availability and affordability, and a general lack of affordability that, of course, is partly related to constraints on availability. And I think what also needs saying is that in most places where I can think about where people recognise the housing situation to be broadly in crisis, the crisis is one of both ownership and rental. It's in both ownership and rental that affordability is very, very constrained. But what I would also say is that if we want to talk about genuine crisis, I think for the most part, maybe this is a contestable assertion, but it seems to me that genuine crisis conditions are very much concentrated in the rental sector in much of the world these days. That's where most very, very vulnerable households tend to be concentrated, more in the rental sector than in the owner-occupied sector. Of course, in the immediate wake of the global financial crisis, not least in a country like Spain, that looked quite different. But today, at least, I think in large part, the housing crisis is a crisis of rent and renting and renters. And I think the other thing that it's fair to say is that the general sense that housing is in crisis, it does appear to be not in total part, but in significant part, a post-global financial crisis phenomenon. Housing crisis has plainly accelerated and proliferated over the past 10 to 15 years in many different countries. Okay. So that's what I want to say mainly about housing crisis, just to set the scene, but obviously to say that there are all sorts of kind of very, very negative downstream effects of that crisis of availability and affordability, not least things like overcrowding and homelessness. So in many countries, the UK being a very, very good example. Sweden is also a good example. But levels of homelessness have skyrocketed over the past 10 to 15 years. And even in parts of Sweden where homelessness would have been largely non-existent 20 years ago, there are now significant levels of homelessness. And I think that there are all sorts of other downstream conditions, but fundamentally we're talking about a crisis of availability and affordability. So, in terms of why we have this profoundly deleterious and damaging situation, I'm going to run through 4 different sets of factors that I, in my view, having thought about and studied housing for quite a long time now, have been of more than just local significance, by which I mean they have been significant factors in many of the parts of the world where we now have housing crisis conditions. And I'm going to put to one side the question of financialization now and come back to financialization after I've talked about those. Okay, so to run through those 4. The first of those, and as I said at the beginning, these varies to a significant extent between different countries. Some of them you will, I think, recognize very, very strongly in the Spanish context. Some of them you might not even recognize at all. So in no particular order, the first of these is the withdrawal of the state as a significant actor on the supply side in the housing sector, by which I mean the role of the state, whether the central state and or municipal governments, in the ownership, operation and management of housing, rental housing, and in many countries as a significant subsidizer of the supply of affordable housing on the supply side. So in many parts of the world, although I believe that Spain is somewhat the exception here, the state used to play a very, very significant role. A, in owning and operating genuinely affordable housing, and B, in providing significant subsidy to the provision of, on the supply side, to the provision of affordable housing by the private sector. So the UK, for example, where I'm from, is a classic example of that. If you go back to the end of the 1970s, a third of all dwellings, not rental dwellings, a third of all dwellings were council-owned rental properties in the UK. So local councils played an enormously significant role as a supplier of affordable, below market rent housing. That role has been substantially diminished in recent decades. At the same time, not just in the UK, but lots of other countries, the state has withdrawn from providing significant subsidy to enable private sector actors to supply genuinely affordable housing, such that in most countries around the world today, you have a housing sector that is essentially dominated by the private sector. And it doesn't take a genius to figure out that the private sector doesn't really have any explicit interest in the supply of genuinely affordable housing. That's not what the private sector is for. The private sector is there for a whole set of other reasons, and the supply of affordable housing will be done, of course, if that is something that appears to be a profitable proposition. But if it's not a profitable proposition, then it won't be done, because that's not what the private sector is for. But that's the situation we have today, is where the state has really withdrawn, which is not to say the state isn't involved in providing any subsidy. Of course it does, but that subsidy today, to the extent that it exists, is much more on the demand side, through the provision of subsidies to things like mortgages on the owner-occupied side, and to the subsidisation of rent on the rent side through things like housing benefit, rent vouchers, rent support. It takes different forms in different countries, but in pretty much all countries where that exists, it is clearly very, very limited both in scope and in scale. So the number of people that need some form of support for rent do not receive it. So it's only some people that need rent support actually get it. And then when you get it, it tends to be insufficient to their needs as well. So the withdrawal of the state has been a very, very significant contributory factor in many, many different countries, although not all. That's the first one. Second factor that I want to point to is falling levels of construction of property. And what I would hasten to add here is that this flows to a significant extent from the first of these factors. So if the state is neither actively developing and building property itself, nor actively subsidising the development of property by the private sector, particularly on the rental side, then of course, all other things being equal, you're going to get falling levels of construction. And yes, there have been periods, not in Spain, of massive building surges. Obviously, between the mid-1990s and 2006 in Spain, you had unprecedented levels of housing construction. But for the most part, around the world, levels of housing construction have fallen. And I think that the point to make here is that levels of housing construction have fallen specifically in those areas where housing is needed. So, of course, one of the things that's most notable about Spain's housing construction binge in that decade was that much of the housing was built precisely in places where it wasn't needed, rather than in the main urban centres of Spain. And that is a pattern that has been replicated in certain other parts of the world as well. And I guess one of the points I want to make here, which maybe will be somewhat controversial, maybe not, is to say that you don't. I don't think you need to necessarily go all the way in the direction of the kind of the classic liberal critique, which is that it's all about building more houses, which is something that, as I understand it, you hear here, as well as in the UK, the US, Sweden, everywhere else, to agree that there is a problem with supply, and that supply is physically constrained, particularly in many urban regions, which is not to say it's the only problem, nor is it to say it's necessarily the most important problem, but it's clearly a factor. That supply has become increasingly constrained in many, many urban regions. And as I say, you don't have to kind of go all the way in the direction of that liberal discourse, which is very much, it's all about building more houses, because clearly it's not just about building more houses, but it's also clearly true that there are many parts of the world that do need more construction. Okay, so that's the second thing, is falling levels of construction. The third factor, which has been incredibly important to understanding where we are today with housing, is mortgage market liberalisation, by which I mean, in very, very general terms, the way in which, particularly from the 1980s onwards, I mean, the timing varied a bit in different countries, the way in which it became easier for a larger share of the population to borrow money and to borrow more money to buy housing, to invest in owner occupation. And I think the significance of this actually can't be overstated. And so that tended to work in two main ways, with which I'm sure you'll all be familiar to one extent or another. So one of those was that requirements around loan-to-value ratios and deposits were relaxed. So it became possible for people to borrow more money relative to the value of the property that they were buying. So if, for example, historically you'd only been able to borrow, say, 60% of the value of a property, then over time that percentage went up and up and up, to the point that before the global financial crisis you could borrow 90, 95, even 100% of the value of the property. So you had very, very relaxed lending requirements, which made it more possible for a larger share of the population to borrow to buy, and to borrow more to buy. And then the second thing, the other way in which those requirements were relaxed, was in terms of loan to income multiples. So one of the ways in which lenders look at these things, obviously, is in relation to how much a household earns. And so if, for example, historically, a household was only able to borrow, say, 2 times income to take out a mortgage to buy a house, that multiple went up over time, such that again, before the global financial crisis, you were allowed to borrow 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times income. And the relaxation of those mortgage standards has played a huge effect in many parts of the world, including in Spain, in where we have ended up. And of course, the proximate effects of that are that you got prices went up a lot, and actually, I think that if I was asked to point to one factor more than any other that has been the main contributing factor to rising house prices around the world in recent decades, I would say this is it: relaxed mortgage lending requirements. So, if on average house prices around the world, or I don't know what, 2 times what they were in real terms 20 or 30 years ago, my argument will be that is primarily house prices adjusting to a new credit environment. It's reacting to a new environment where credit is more readily available, often more cheaply available, and people are able to take on more debt. So prices have responded to that liberalised mortgage market environment. But the other thing, of course, that's responded is levels of household debt. Prices have gone up, but so have the levels of debt the households have taken on in order to enable that spending. One other thing I want to say about the significance of this factor, because I think this is really, really important, is to say that I think that there were 2 sort of phases of historical effect of mortgage market liberalisation. And so the first of those is a kind of democratization, right? So you could argue, and I think that there's actually grounds for making this argument, that insofar as home ownership, owner occupation is something that people like and want, which I know is generally the case in Spain, it's absolutely a homeowner society, then you could argue that liberalising the mortgage market and enabling people who historically were kind of excluded from home ownership by virtue of the inability to get a mortgage was a good thing. And I kind of buy that to a certain extent. So what happened, for example, where I'm from in the UK, was that as the mortgage market was liberalising, rates of home ownership went from maybe 50 to 55% in the 1970s, all the way up to 70% or so. And of course, in Spain, it went much higher, up to nearly 90%, I think, certainly above 85%. And so there was a democratizing effect, right? So that people who had been locked out of home ownership were suddenly able to enter home ownership and accrue, home ownership assets, housing wealth. So that was the sort of first effect you saw, with rising home ownership rates, not only driven by, but significantly driven by mortgage market liberalisation. However, that then kind of reached a peak where, because of the rising prices and because of the rising levels of debt that were being taken on, eventually affordability constraints kicked in, despite mortgage market liberalisation, as the market responded to the new credit conditions, and people at the margin now began to get priced out, particularly young people, right? And so what happened, including in places like the UK, was that from that peak of around 70%, home ownership rates began to fall. And they began to fall around 2005, 2006. And they fell quite far, but they fell particularly far for young people. So if they fell from, say, 70% to 63% for households in general, they fell from, I don't know, I'm plucking figures out of the air here, 60% to 30% for 25 to 34-year-olds. So it was particularly young people that got locked out of the housing market during this second phase. There's an important historical trajectory, a story to the impact of mortgage market liberalisation. But it's been hugely important to understanding where we are today. So that's the third one. Fourth and finally, has been, and again, this will be very obvious to you all in this room and from the Spanish context, is reform of the rental sector, and particularly reform of the private rental sector. And again, this story it looks very, very different from country to country. And the timing of it, the substance of it differs. But in general terms, I would say that the trend has been twofold from the 1980s onwards. The first of those has been a gradual weakening or indeed a total removal of rent controls. So a weakening or removal of controls on the price of rent. Which again, it's gone through different periods, and certainly in some places there's been a spring back from that to a certain extent. But the general story is one of a removal or weakening of rent controls. That's certainly true in Sweden where I live. It's obviously true in the UK. It's true in most parts of the world that I can think about. And then the allied part of that story, as well as a removal or weakening of rent controls, has been a gradual weakening of the security of tenants. The security of tenure has gradually been weakened. And I would say probably the UK is the best example of that, where essentially you went from a situation in the 1980s and before with tenants having quite a degree of security of tenure to having no security of tenure, where from 1988 onwards, landlords could evict tenants without having to have any reason to do that. So no fault evictions. And it's only now, nearly 40 years later, that those no fault evictions are finally being abolished in the UK. To be about 40 years of landlords having completely the upper hand in terms of being able to kick out tenants for needing to have no legal reason to do that in the UK. So the UK is a very extreme version of a broader story of a weakening of tenant security. And of course, the flip side to conditions becoming less attractive for tenants through removal or weakening of rent controls and weakening of tenant security has been a greater attractiveness for landlords, right? To the extent that things become less attractive for tenants, they typically become more attractive to landlords. It's not completely a zero-sum game, but it's pretty much a zero-sum game, where the gains of one or the disbenefits of the other. And so I'd say that's the fourth kind of meta story that has been really, really historically significant. Okay, so now I'm gonna talk a bit about where financialization fits in this story, and again, just to go back to what I was saying earlier. When I'm talking about financialization, I'm talking about both the growing tendency for various actors to privilege the exchange value, the market value of their house, whether that's a house they live in or a house that they let, and also the growing involvement of financial actors of various kinds. And I think it's clear, and this is widely documented, that in recent decades we have seen more and more speculative investment in housing across the board. This will not be news to anyone in this room. And if we want to refer to that as a form of financialization, then that's fine. But it's clearly the case that has been happening again by both owner occupiers and I would say especially by landlords, and that speculative investment has clearly had an impact in terms of price inflation, the price inflation of housing. I want to focus more on the growing role of financial actors here, which is I guess where my own research has focused more. And I'll talk about some of the variants in this because I think this is a really important point to make clear. But where financial actors have become much more heavily involved in the ownership of rental housing as a form of financial investment. So, of course, when financial institutions, could be private equity houses, doesn't necessarily have to be private equity firms, when they're investing in housing, they're investing in the same way they invest in any other type of asset. They want two things from that investment in some combination. They want that investment to generate regular, reliable income for them. That's what the rents provide them with, is that regular income. And they want that investment to provide a capital gain such that if and when they come to sell that portfolio of housing, they can sell it at the higher price that they bought it at. Those are the two things that they're obviously interested in. And I actually think one of the interesting stories here, I won't get into it now, but the question of why it was specifically after the financial crisis that in many, many parts of the world, not just in Spain, investment in these types of residential assets by big financial institutions really took off at that particular moment is a really, really important one. And there are many parts to that answer. But anyway, where that has happened and where financial institutions have become relatively significant owners of rental housing, I think there is now accumulating evidence of more than just an anecdotal kind that tends to be a bad thing for tenants, right? And so, and I emphasize that point about anecdotal. So for many years, particularly the 5 or 6 years after the financial crisis, and I think America was a very good example of this. There were torrents of stories in the press about people having horrific experiences with Blackstone as a landlord, effluent, in their water, spiders and cockroaches, and I was always somewhat leery of those stories because, of course, you could find exactly the same stories if your landlord was just a small amateur landlord as well. Those bad landlords, to put it in quote marks, are a feature of the rental sector in general. They're not specific to major financial institution. And so I think while that evidence was merely anecdotal, it was important to kind of reserve judgment to some extent. However, I think there is now accumulating evidence of a more sort of robust scientific kind that points to the deleterious effects of ownership by these institutions, including in Spain. But for example, in the US, there's lots of research now that has looked at in various different metropolitan regions in the US that looks at the tenant experiences in terms of things like evictions and rent increases, and has found that on both of those measures, things have progressed worse for tenants in housing owned by financial institutions than by other types of private sector access. So not even public sector owners, but other types of private sector landlords within those metropolitan regions. So you're worse off in terms of you're likely to be evicted and other measures, particularly rent increases, in housing owned by these types of actors. So it's quite clear where they are involved, that there is a general tendency for that to be a relatively negative thing. Now, of course, what I would emphasize is this is an incredibly uneven phenomenon, both internationally and within countries. So I would say that at one end of the spectrum, you have countries like the US, and maybe even more particularly Germany, as being countries where ownership of rental housing by major corporate landlords, not just major financial institutions, but corporate landlords in general, has become a very, very significant phenomenon quantitatively. So in Germany, I haven't got the numbers to hand, but a very, very significant share of rental housing is owned by corporate landlords in general, financial actors, in particular their private equity firms from both the UK and US became and remain very, very significant actors in the German rental market, mainly because when a lot of publicly owned housing in Germany was privatised, it was sold off en masse to those types of buyers rather than being sold on a kind of piecemeal basis, which is what occurred in many other places. So Germany and US and actually Sweden and a few other countries at one end of the spectrum. But then at the other end of the spectrum, we have a country like the UK, which maybe that surprises some people, but major corporate landlords play almost no role in the UK housing market. At least in the British housing market, somewhat more of a role in the Irish housing market. But the overwhelming majority of rental housing in the UK is owned by small landlords who own 1, 2, 3, 4 rental properties, not owned by major landlords. In fact, the landlord that has the biggest number of rental homes in the UK, owns about 13,000 homes. And it's a company that you would never would have heard of called Granger. So there is just simply no significant role for those types of actors in the UK rental market, which is something that's often surprised a lot of people, which is not to say they don't want a role in that market. They would love to be involved in that market. But the key issue, right, is that opportunities to acquire large portfolios of rental housing simply haven't occurred in countries like the UK, where, as many of you will know, when housing was privatised by the Thatcher government and subsequent governments, it's principally through enabling sitting tenants to buy their properties rather than through sale to large landlords. So it doesn't really exist in the UK market to any significant extent. Spain, I think, interestingly, is somewhere between those two extremes. But I think is probably, if we're being honest, is closer to the UK end. Of course, it varies a lot by region. Barcelona is somewhere where those big institutional actors have a much more significant role than in other parts of the country. But as I understand it, in excess of 90%, certainly in excess of 85% of rental housing in Spain is owned by very small actors. Of course, as I say, in Barcelona and in certain other cities, the share is higher, but it's closer to the UK end of the story than it is to the other end of the story. And so I think that that's one of the reasons why the picture is somewhat more complicated than is sometimes we imagine it to be. So for sure, those private equity firms have become much more significant actors in the last 10 to 15 years. But at the same time, the share of Spanish households that owns more than one property and is earning rent on property that they let to other people trebled between the financial crisis and today. So small landlords are a much more significant phenomenon in Spain today than they were 15 years ago, as well as those big corporate actors. It's a multifaceted story, and I think you have to understand both parts of that story to understand where the housing crisis is today and why it looks like it does. Okay, I just want to say a couple more things about financialization before I try and wrap up. The first of those is that, and this is something I hinted at earlier, is I think that what we refer to as financialization exists in a relatively complex and important relationship with some of those other factors that I talked about earlier, by which I mean it's both to some extent cause, but also to some extent an effect. So in terms of being a kind of a causal factor, I think what we refer to as financialization has clearly had a knock-on effect in terms of those falling levels of construction that I talked about. So if you are an owner of housing or any other property asset, commercial property or residential property, who privileges the market value of that housing, all other things that being equal, you will tend to not want to see new property development in your area, if for no other reason that the laws of supply and demand tend to suggest that more supply means lower rental prices. And so, to the extent that you want to understand what's often referred to as the NIMBY phenomenon, so various different types of actors being against the new development of new property in urban regions, then I think clearly the financialization of housing or property more general has had a significant impact there. More people and more institutions valuing housing for the asset value tends to make more NIMBY type actors and falling levels of construction. And it's not coincidental that if you listen to the likes of Blackstone, when they talk about where they invest in housing, they invest precisely in areas where no new housing is being built. So they will often, when they talk to the media, they'll sometimes say, we're part of the solution to the housing crisis. That's clearly not true, because when they talk to their investors, they say, no. That's the last thing we want to do is build more housing. We want supply to remain constrained because it's supply constraints that keep upwards pressure on rents. And so they invest precisely in areas where supply is constrained. And if they see new supply, new construction going on, they take that as a signal to get the hell out rather than to actually stay invested in that area. So there's clearly a relationship there to levels of construction. In terms of kind of a reciprocal relationship, things operating in the other direction, I think it's important to understand what I've been referring to as financialization as partly a consequence of things like the withdrawal of the state, and partly a consequence, as I said earlier, of reform of the private rental sector. So to the extent, and this is something Shane and I were mentioning when we were talking earlier, to the extent that the state says, no, we are no longer going to be a significant actor in the provision of housing, the development of housing, but the state continues to want investment to go into housing, into new construction, then of course if the state takes public sector investment, public sector financing off the table, then what else is left on the table to the public sector? It's private sector development, private sector financing. And so it's no coincidence that in those sorts of countries that private equity firms, other deep-pocketed investors are seen as the solution to the housing crisis, because they're the ones with the money. And if the state has decided that it's not going to invest itself in new housing, then it doesn't really have much of a choice rather than relying on private sector actors, which is why politicians cozy up to the Blackstones and the BlackRocks of this world, because they're kind of hoping that they will do the development that the public sector no longer wants to do. And so that growing financialization, the growing involvement of those financial sector actors is partly a consequence of state withdrawal. It's what you get when the state withdraws from seeing housing as a significant area of public service provision. Those actors are effectively being invited in, implicitly, if not always explicitly, but often it's implicit rather than explicit. Sometimes it's explicit as well. I think the only other thing I want to say about that is that I think also financialization, and particularly I'm thinking here about when we talk about households and the growing role of households as landlords, so owning 2, 3 properties rather than one property and letting out a second or a third property, also has to be understood in context. It also has to be, I have no idea the extent to which this is true in Spain, but certainly in the UK, we've had decades of wage stagnation in the UK. And if you listen to what landlords say, amateur landlords say about why they're doing it, in many cases they're doing it because they see an absence of other opportunities to get ahead economically, right? And I think it's wrong to just kind of dismiss that out of hand. If you're looking at a UK economy where wages have been stagnant for decades in real terms, productivity is stagnant, then I don't think it's necessarily surprising that certain times people think that being an amateur landlord is like one of the few options available to them to develop any kind of economic security over the long term. But I think if we moralise about that, which I think on the left we sometimes do, that's not necessarily a helpful stance to take to understand why it's going on. And actually, if you look at the UK, where something like 3 million households are amateur landlords, they're generally not rich households. The average income of those households before the rent they earn from letting their property is below the median average income of households in the UK. So this is typically not affluent households, it's ordinary households looking for some way to get ahead in a situation of pretty drastic economic precarity in the UK today. So again, understanding this in context, I think, is very, very, very important. Okay. I'm going to finish by just saying a few words about kind of what all this might mean in terms of prospects for positive change. And I think it's quite helpful to frame it in terms of the idea of a right to housing, which some countries have in their constitutions. Brazil, for example, has a right to housing in its constitution. It's kind of meaningless, but it's there, and it's obviously a concept that on the left in particular is an attractive concept for many reasons. I think for very, very good reasons. I think the reality, obviously, today is that it doesn't exist in any practical or meaningful shape. And I actually think an interesting way to think about it is to say that what is actually has actually been prioritized in recent decades, so-called neoliberal decades, in Western societies, at least, is that you have a right to buy housing. That's your right. Will enable you and encourage you to buy housing. But the idea that you have a right to housing per se, rather than a right to buy housing, has become a very, very foreign concept. And it seems to me that if you look at history, not just in a country like Spain, but internationally, my sense is that you need, at a minimum, two things, I think, to have any significant likelihood of what you might call a fair and progressive and functional housing system, which so many countries lack today. Sweden, often thought of as the kind of paragon of the left, does not have a functional housing system today by any stretch of the imagination. I think it used to a significant extent. But it seems to me that the two things that it's pretty hard to get beyond is, one, you do need a much more active public sector. You need a much more active state involved in essentially correcting market failures, right? I mean, this is a reductive way of thinking about it, but housing is, to a significant extent, a quintessential case of market failure. If you leave things to the market, this, which is what we've increasingly done around the world, you end up with a situation in which we are broadly in today. The market does not produce a housing market that is serviceable for the whole of the population, at least of all the most vulnerable members of the population. So you do need a much more active state. The state with, and going back to what I said earlier, state withdrawal has been a big part in many, many countries around the world, if not all, to where we've ended up today. And I think the other thing that I often kind of point to, and I want to point to it again this evening, is the idea of what's often referred to as tenure neutrality. And for those of you who haven't heard of this concept, the idea of tenure neutrality is basically the idea that ownership, so own occupation, and renting should be treated as equally important and equally valid and equally worthy tenures. And policy should be housing policy, in particular, not just housing policy, should be crafted in such a way that one tenure is not advantaged over the other. And it seems to me that around the whole world, in recent decades, we've gotten away from ideas of tenure neutrality completely, where to the extent that the ideology of home ownership has become absolutely hegemonic, not least in Spain, in recent decades. And I think that the ideology of home ownership is a massively corrosive ideology for so many reasons, and not the least of which is that it generates this idea that renting is a kind of almost like a substandard existence in some way, and that it should be something that you want to escape from, and it elevates or advance to home ownership, and it creates a political environment in which, in general, political actors are loath to treat the rental sector as an object worthy of support and investment and careful treatment. And everywhere you look around the world today, I think that's broadly the case, is that the ideology of home ownership is dominant. And it was remarkable to me, actually, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, that even The Economist, the kind of the mouthpiece of capitalist liberalism, basically came out with this really interesting editorial saying the ideology of home ownership has been, I think the terms it uses is like the biggest economic policy mistake of the post-war era. And I totally agree with that. I mean, I think that it has been catastrophically bad, but we are so far away from correcting that mistake because that ideology is so culturally ingrained around the world that it becomes very, very hard to see, this is going to sound like a very morbid message, but it becomes very, very hard to be positive about the housing sector, given the extent to which it's been outsourced to the private sector and to markets, and given the extent to which the ideology of home ownership is grown. And of course, the reality is that home ownership is not a superior tenure. The policy measures that could be taken to make home ownership much less attractive are available. They're not difficult, but they're politically impossible to a significant extent. Land value taxes, 100% taxes on capital gain. You could quite easily create a situation politically through relatively simple policy measures that would make renting appear much, much more attractive than home ownership. But of course, no political party is going to go there, not least because homeowners vote more than renters do, and because home ownership is the majority of the electorate in most countries, not least in countries like Spain. So I'm going to leave it there. Hopefully there's lots of food for thought there, and I'm welcome to any questions, criticisms, objections, whatever else it might be. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Before getting into it, I want to say that Brett's book, not the last one that he published, but the one that's been translated by Traficantes de Sueños, it talks a lot about housing, the asset manager's relation to housing, but it also talks about infrastructures. I mean, there's a whole line of research, an avenue of research that you're opening up, really. And it's really fascinating. Like, you give examples of how there are particular regions, for instance, in the UK, where the water is managed by this asset manager, energy by this other, housing, hospitals, schools. It's really, really impressive. I'm saying this because I'm going to get into the housing debate, but if you haven't read the book, I mean, it's really an eye-opener. Okay, so I think we mostly agree on your take. Like we're very close. Here at the at IDRA, we have a very similar kind of reading on the problem. We agree on the impact of mortgage deregulation and credit extension. The impact on prices. How that goes hand in hand with the drive to turn housing into an asset. But of course, you said something that's very provocative here, especially for the left. Because you said, I mean, we agree on that. So I'm going to talk about what we don't agree on, or where I think there is debate, which is something we like to do.
Yeah,
so don't take this as a.
Oh, I have personal.
Yeah, we've had some people asking us. So you invite people to present their book, or just to to give them a hard time? It's not going to happen.
No, it's fine.
So you said that we have a problem with the falling rate of construction, right? Spain, like other countries, is an example of how the way that governments and the market has built, especially since the mid-80s, has not allowed us to have more affordable housing, right? So, at least in Spain, there is a consensus among the left. I wouldn't say against building, but around the idea that just letting the market build is not gonna, you're not gonna build your way out of the crisis. And actually, when you were talking about the kind of the post-World War framework, what we had there, as you said, was a very strong state, very strong governments. So I would add, like my caveat would be that we would probably need a lot of social housing production. And actually, what really felt like, it's not just that there are falling rates of construction, especially since the great financial crisis, but there are falling rates of social housing construction since the 1980s. As a result of a very specific political project in the country where you come from, led by Thatcher, but we have our own Thatcher here, you know, so Chaga, Boyer, the treasury ministers. Um, so the question though is why we have such falling rates of construction today, and I think you hinted at them. One of the things we're finding among people who have the money to invest in the production of housing is that the profits of building are comparatively low to short-term investments. So if you tell a capital owner, an asset manager, a fund that, okay, we want to build and the profit is going to be around 7, 8%, like as local politicians are saying, they're going to be like, well, you know, I can do that. I can get an even higher yield with short-term investments with much lower risk, right? So in spite of the fact that there's been a lot of talk of build to rent, so you know like how private equity funds have gotten involved in build to rent schemes, so they not just buy assets, but they actually build. So they just not buy existing ones, but they build new ones. What we're saying is that they mostly invest in already existing assets. So, and this is something that you give figures in your book that are really astonishing. I think you mentioned that is it 80% of the investments by asset managers are basically here. So they invest 80% of what they invest is in already existing assets. So which gives you an idea. All right. So that takes us to the question of the power and the weight of financial actors today, which is very important in your previous book, but also in your most recent book. You talk about, I don't know, I've read it in Spanish, you talk about the propietario universal, the universal owner, universal landlord, how do you call it in English? It's translated as propietarios universales. When you talk about BlackRock,
universal owners.
Universal landlords, right?
Universal owners, yeah.
Yeah, and then you say they own a lot. I mean, they own more than any other actor, but it's around like, between 5 and 10% of the stock, of the housing stock in the real estate market or in the rental market. And then you come to the conclusion, as you said in your presentation, that it's actually a small proportion of the housing system. Actually, and then you said actually the vast majority of landlords are small landlords. We've done a lot of research trying to understand that specific problem. What we're saying is that yes, if you look at the total amount of landlords, it's true that around 85% of landlords own either 1 or 2 rental units. But what you have to look at is how is the rental market distributed? So if you look at this, then you discover that those small landlords actually have a relatively small share of the supply, of the rental supply. And what we're seeing in countries like Spain is the growth of, together with the big private equity funds, the growth of we could call them multi-proprietors, especially the group that's growing the most is those that own between 6 and 10 housing units. So they're not mega landlords, but they're not small landlords either, I would say. Okay, so but going back to your point that actually these so-called universal landlords or owners own a small proportion of the housing supply. Actually, this is what is very often said by liberal commentators, think tanks, and lobbyists. They say, actually, and we have papers, we have a constant production of papers from faculties, economists, saying that they have a very limited effect on prices. And then their main argument is that private equity funds or asset managers, they have very limited effects on housing affordability, of housing prices. And secondly, that they are the only ones who can increase the supply by building. That's why they actually welcome the idea of let's build to rent. No? But the problem, what we're seeing, is that the kind of housing that they're building, even though they call it affordable, asequible all the time, it's not that they're either bad or good people. It's like their business model makes it impossible to actually produce affordable housing, right? But there is a very strong sense among our policymakers in our governments that we really depend on them. That's a very strong idea.
Yeah.
They're the ones that have the money, they own the resources, so we depend on them if we want to have more affordable housing. And actually, that kind of argument, the idea that dependemos de ellos, that we depend on them, is very often used almost as like in these horror stories in the media. I see some journalists among us today. We very often hear and read about horror stories of how, look, Blackstone is fleeing, and this is due to all of the regulations by the socialist government. But actually, I invite you to read Fred's book. Because in your book, we knew this, but you really outline it very clearly. You explain how many of these funds are fondos cerrados, like closed funds, is that how I call it in English? So their business model is based on basically, we're going to invest during a period of from 7 to 12 years. But the idea is that, after that period, we stop investing, which means it's exactly what Blackstone and other actors have been doing here in other countries. So they started their business here, investing here around the mint, 2011, 12, 13. And they've been talking about selling for several years. So it kind of coincides with the kind of business model that you described. So minimum of 7 years, maximum of 12 years, but not more. So, because that's a question that we often get asked, like journalists and other people ask us, do you think that the real estate cycle that started after the great financial crisis is over, and this has to do with the fact that the government is putting limits to the profits of these actors? I want to know what you think, but my take on that is that, okay, regulations are important, but they've been trying to sell for a long time now. I mean, it's been in their agenda because their plan was not to stay. Their plan was not to become permanent landlords, but to buy, maybe rent for a while, and then sell and make a profit. So, and then here's where I really want to talk about this, if you can get into it. So in your book, you talk about how they own more and more resources, these actors. But at the same time, so they invest and then they disinvest, right? And in you, somehow you say clearly in your book that it's very complicated to actually know how much they own because basically their business is based on opacity. So it's very hard to know who you're paying your rent to, who you're paying your energy bills to. But there seems to be a contradiction there. We don't know, is this something in the mid long run? Are they gonna own more and more? Is that in their agenda, to increase their portfolios? So that's another question. Yeah. And then another related question is, so recently, over the last years, we've seen how, especially inequality economists, are focusing a lot on the wealthy. They talk about the ultra-rich, the billionaires. We have people like Gabriel Zucman, the French economist, who were with Piketty and others. By the way, today we were in New York with Mamdani talking about how we need to tax the rich. But that's kind of their framework. So some researchers speak of the ultra-rich and the super wealthy, but you focus on asset managers and these kinds of big vehicles. So my question is for you, are these two ways of analyzing the same problem? Or do you think that actually focusing on these financial institutions helps us understand it? the challenge there that we're facing. And finally, I just wanted to ask about potential solutions, because this is what we do here. So we think of not just who owns and manages resources, but how we can take back control of them. So one of the conclusions from listening to you, from reading you, would be that we just need a stronger public system. So we need a muscular public system, government, potentially. Because what we're seeing today is that we have, this is also something that inequality economists point out, how we have both so-called disenfranchised or weakened middle class, but also same happens with government. So both the government and the working class or middle classes are being impoverished, right? So they're less wealthy. Whereas, have all this, the ultra rich, through their vehicles, getting wealthier and wealthier. So one of the ideas that's floating around, actually my brother David Colomera has written about this with some people like you see in the public today. One of the ideas is like the idea of a public sovereign fund, right? And so how do we actually take control of the central bank? Actually, David Harvey, we interviewed him a while ago, and he said, maybe the question is, how did he say it? Storm. We need to storm the central bank. I think it's something like that. Because the central bank is the one that can actually produce money for governments to actually invest in the production of public housing, in the acquisition of housing, of market housing that can then be turned into public housing. So my question would be, do you have an idea of how we could do this? Do you also abide by the idea of a sovereign fund, or however we want to call it? And then the other question is, what do we do with the market? Because as you said, the vast majority of the housing today in most countries is in the market. So one of the things here that we are pursuing is, how do we use the law, the government, to turn market housing that has been turned into an asset, to turn it into social housing. So for instance, one of the things that the Catalan government has done recently, and no other government has done it across Spain, is to increase taxes for individuals trying to buy a new housing unit who already own at least 5 properties. So they have a 20% tax. It's a transaction tax. Yeah. And at the same time, the government has done another thing, which is a help to buy scheme for young people under 35. But for the first time, this help to buy scheme has one condition, which is that you become a homeowner, but you can never sell the housing unit for more than what you paid for it plus inflation. So it's a way of saying, I help you become a homeowner. As you said, it's kind of there's a strong culture there. But at the same time, I'm turning that home, the housing unit, into, I'm making it a part of the social housing system, or here with social housing, it's not the exact translation. Here we talk about vivienda protegida, which I like, because it kind of conveys it's protected from speculative kind of spirals and dynamics. But yeah, I wanted to ask you, do you think that we have to intervene the market in ways that will give also less power to those who already amass a lot of wealth, a lot of property, etc., through things like taxation, which is a very strong undercurrent in the left now, tax the rich kind of narrative? Or do you think we have to do that another kind of intervention?
The stock argument is, they have a minimal effect on prices in the house. But in a way, that's a very curious thing to say, because that's almost like the least important thing, is whether they're having any impact. Irrespective of whether they're all probably not having any impact, but that's not really what people can and do care about, right? The much more important thing is what the impact, if any, they have on the tenant experience, which is not a question of house prices, it's a question of rent, and it's a question of treatment of tenants through practices like eviction. And so one of the obvious counterpoints to those arguments that get made is one that I kind of hinted at in what I taught, which is to say that all of this is highly variegated geographically, and one of the reasons they have a much more significant impact on the rental market than those overall averages suggest is that their investments are geographically concentrated. That's what they do. They invest in specific geographical areas precisely, and again, this is something they say in their quiet moments when they think they're not being listened to, is that they invest in those particular geographical areas partly in order to try and accrue pricing power over the rental market in those areas. You know, if you own upwards of 20 or 30% of the rental property in a particular neighbourhood, then you potentially get to a point where you can make rather than just take rental prices in that area. And so that was one of the reasons why they became major investors in the US housing, in the US rental market after the financial crisis, because foreclosures were very geographically concentrated in particular areas. So the likes of Blackstone concentrated on acquiring property in particular areas, parts of Atlanta, parts of Seattle, parts of Phoenix, and in those parts of those cities, they were able to build up portfolios that represented 20, 30, 40% of the rental property in particular segments of the rental market, and there you can have a completely different effect. And so it's that discourse around they're not affecting prices in the property. It's a kind of meaningless discourse to a significant extent, because that's not how we should be gauging their influence. It's through things like eviction rates, and it's through things like their propensity to invest in the upkeep and maintenance and renovation of those properties. And they do that in a very selective way, right? They invest in markets where you can, and Sweden's a great case in this, they invest in markets where the nature of rent regulation is that if you undertake relatively cosmetic renovations, that enables you to substantially lift rents in a way that you're otherwise unable to do. So they're very smart, they're very canny investors, and the thing to be cognizant of is the broader kind of liberal discourse, media discourse around the quote unquote impacts of these investors is almost always focused on investment metrics rather than the types of metrics they should be focused on. Well, and which is not surprising, right? The journalists aren't necessarily informed about these types of issues, and so they get led a merry dance by these types of investors because these are smart, they're not stupid people, they're savvy people who know what they're doing, and they know how to lead that discourse. The next question, which I think is really important, which is another part of that discourse, which is interesting that you say it's here, because it's the discourse, the political discourse is saturated in places other than the UK, is the idea that we're relying on responding to investors. And I think this is a difficult one, right? Because to a significant extent, it's true.
Yeah, we have the.
And what I mean by that is that, like, if you as a government, whether that's centrally or municipally, have persuaded yourself or allowed yourself to be persuaded that it's fiscally irresponsible to borrow more money to finance investment in infrastructures of various kinds, of which housing would be one, because the bond market won't like it. They'll punish you or discipline you for being fiscally irresponsible. If you have taken large-scale public investment off the table, then what other choice do you have than private capital? And if you're if you are reliant upon private capital to undertake investment in new housing and other infrastructure, then pretty soon you do end up with private equity firms, simply because that's where the bulk of surplus capital available for investment within contemporary capitalism increasingly tends to be concentrated. They're the ones that have command of surplus capital available for investment. So it doesn't, ultimately it comes back, I think, to this question about the viability of public investment. And I know economists, but my sense is that is twofold, which is that on the one hand, I think the fiscal constraints are real, unfortunately, to a certain extent, and the fiscal constraints in many parts of the world are greater than they were previously. Yeah, by which I mean like levels of public debt compared to GDP are high, substantially higher than they were in the past. So I think there are some real fiscal constraints. But the second part is that I also think that the governments have much greater capacity in rich countries like the global north in general. Despite the fact that those fiscal constraints are real, governments absolutely have much more capacity to borrow for revenue-generating investments like housing than they suggest that they do. So they're not as hamstrung by the bond markets as they like to suggest. And I think this is all part of neoliberal ideology, right? They bought into that ideology that the public sector cannot and should not be investing in these types of things. So I think that's the other thing I've said. The constraints are real, but they're not as real as people like to suggest. But as I say, once you take that off the table, you what other options do you have other than the private sector? And so, and it's definitely true that as soon as a government says, whether it's to do with housing or water or energy, as soon as governments say, okay, you guys have been behaving irresponsible, we are going to tighten regulation, we are going to make sure that you can't undertake evictions as kind of liberally as you have been doing. The very next day, those firms come out and say, okay, we won't invest in the UK anymore, we won't invest in Spain anymore. And governments immediately then back and that's incredibly unfortunate, but it's also to a certain extent understandable if they have persuaded themselves that they're dependent on investment. And of course, it's completely true that those investors, that means the build to rent story you tell is completely the same in the UK. They've taught a good game, but they're not doing it because the profits available for investing in new profits and developing new housing tends to be much lower and more risky than the profits available for investing in housing in supply constrained markets. So of course they're not going to do that. And the last thing they're going to do is investing in building affordable housing. They have absolutely no interest in doing that at all. Last thing I want to say, just very, very quickly, because I know we're running out of time, is I think that government's answer to this all along has been okay. If we are going to rely on the private sector to build, own, and operate what historically were public sector infrastructures of various types, including in some countries housing, energy, transportation, we will rely on regulation to make sure that those actors behave responsibly. But the other thing we will rely on is this kind of notion of corporate social responsibility. We will trust that these will be responsible capitalist actors. My view is that 30 years later, after that kind of discourse around corporate social responsibility, is it now completely clear that corporate social responsibility is a complete myth. The idea that you can engage in light touch regulation, and that the private sector will quote unquote regulate itself, has been proven to be completely unworkable. And that if you give an inch to the private sector, whether that's in housing or any other sector of kind of utility infrastructure, the private sector will take a mile, and that notions of corporate social responsibility are pure rhetoric. And actually, you only need to talk to people that have worked in the private sector, and they will quietly admit that that is true. That if you're operating at the board level of a private sector company, that notion of corporate social responsibility simply aren't taken seriously. So the idea that can be part of the answer around these things is a complete non-starter. There was lots of other things I wanted to say, but I know that I've run out of time.